Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, and it's very nice to be with you. Far better to be in the room with you, but it wasn't possible this week. But thank you so much for the invitation. I think what I would have to say, very briefly, really echoes quite a lot of what you've already heard. But maybe again, with a little bit of a focus on this global picture and what it might mean if you come down and look at some of the implications for the Euro-Atlantic security scene. And really just three observations I'd like to share with you. The first is that I do think that the COVID experience underscores the idea that societies are looking to be protected against a wider range of risks. And in fact, lots of politicians, lots of citizens are using exactly that terminology. They're talking not so much about security these days very often, but protection. You mentioned Emmanuel Macron. I mean, he's used this term very, very often. He's not the only one to talk about the society that protects, a France that protects, a Europe that protects. And I think we need to take that seriously. I mean, health security is obvious, but it's also about the security of infrastructure and many other things that maybe didn't fit into the conventional security calculus in past decades, but are now very much at the center, at least as far as publics look at it. States are getting stronger. States are spending more money to fund their way out of a COVID-induced economic crisis with greater or lesser success in different places. But this will have a real effect on the power of the state. And it will also have an effect, I think, on this balance that we've already heard alluded to, between national interest, nationalism, regional interests, European interests, multilateralism, all of those things. And so it seems to me that it's worth asking the question whether key security alliances will be able to live very comfortably in a world where there is a unilateral approach prevailing in other areas, on economics, in other foreign policy areas, on migration perhaps. This is obviously a set of issues and an open question that has real meaning for the Western Balkans and the whole future of Euro-Atlantic integration in the region, but not to say more about that. The second point I'd make, and this really goes to what Ambassador Negroponte had mentioned, this question of the competition with China and Russia is absolutely driving global strategy these days, as seen certainly from a transatlantic perspective. Will these remain as Cold Wars? Because in fact, they do have many of the characteristics already of a Cold War. Can they remain so? There's a lot to worry about here. For all of the economic interdependence with China, one sees, at least with the United States, but it's starting also with Europe, a fraying of the economic relationship as well. And if that basic sense of interdependence is lost, is it possible to maintain strategic stability with a obviously rising power? I think a very important open question. Russia is clearly number two when looked at in this frame, especially from the United States, or from a transatlantic perspective, but not for everyone, of course. For some, Russia really is issue number one. And there, I think, the departure from Afghanistan is going to help NATO refocus on core questions of territorial defense that have gotten lost to some extent over the last decades. In fact, in an expeditionary way, we're really focusing back on other kinds of problems. But will the United States be there in European security? I do think so. If you look at the last several administrations, in fact, the American presence in European security has been reinforced. It's not smaller, it's larger. Can that be maintained? In a steady state, I think yes, but things could happen in the Indo-Pacific that would change things very, very quickly. And, if you want to step back and see it in a big historical context, you could say maybe we should be talking potentially about the end of a 100-year American pivot to Europe, or more than a 100-year American pivot to Europe. I don't predict that happening anytime soon, but there are pressures out there in the world. The third point I'd make is really that as these geopolitical frictions that we've been talking about, the minister referred to them as well, as these grow, it seems to me we need to keep our eye on some new points of exposure. I'll mention just a couple, but they're particularly relevant to this region from the Balkans to the East Med to the Black Sea that bears very much on security in the Western Balkans. Brinkmanship, first of all, simply the possibility of things going very wrong. I mean, the Eastern Mediterranean gives us examples of this, but also the relationship with Russia in places like the Baltic and around the Black Sea. The lack of strategic dialogue on the one hand, but also a lack of mechanisms simply to contain risks on the other between militaries. Things can easily go wrong. We have examples of this in the past. Can they be contained? One hopes so, but the risks are there. In another sense, a much more political question, the erosion of trust. Trust inside Europe, I would say, trust across the Atlantic. I think some of this is misplaced, but nonetheless it's there. And we have examples like the experience recently in Afghanistan, but also the AUKUS example in Asia, where the erosion of trust is very evident. And it's not just publics. It's, in fact, above all, I think, political elites where this erosion of trust is visible. And without that, it seems to me it's very difficult to have security arrangements function predictably. I mean, that said, I do not think that those kinds of experiences, examples, tell us too much about things like Article 5 commitments, core alliance relationships. I think that's really something else entirely, but we need to think those things through. Also, finally, if I could say on defense burden sharing and this question of strategic autonomy in Europe, burden sharing is not going to go off the agenda for any American administration. It's simply a reality. It may be put in more or less acceptable style, but the basic message is the same. The United States has an interest in seeing Europe spend more and do more. And that includes in areas like the Balkans. But I do think the Biden administration is going to be less orthodox in how this is measured. That it's not all about whether you're spending 2%, but many other things that European countries are doing that don't necessarily get captured in conventional defense budgets. On border control, on maritime security, all sorts of things that bear on the kind of new security agenda broadly, that intelligence sharing, that don't get captured that way. So I think, we'll have to think about new ways to measure this. Strategic autonomy, I mean, the United States, I think, has come around for the most part, most of the strategic establishment to understanding that if Europe can do more and spend more based on a more European logic, that's absolutely fine. I think, personally, that's an American interest, but we could have a debate. And finally, if you permit me just a final word, I think the biggest risk of all is simply complacency. That complacency about stability. And if we think back, for example, to 1940, you can find many examples, but 1914, where the world went from a place of essential stability to chaos in a period of weeks, and that was at a time when things moved much more slowly than they do today. Margaret Macmillan, the famous historian, has made this point very, very eloquently, but so have others. And I think that's worth bearing in mind as well, especially as we all now, in a sense, live in risk-prone regions. So thanks very much. Look forward to the discussion.